Of one God, holy and undivided Trinity. One of the inherent dangers in celebrating the life and witness of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in an almost exclusively white church and in a sermon preached by a white woman is that it is far too easy to sentimentalize and sanitize him, to whitewash him, if you will. To sigh with rapture at his "I have a dream" speech. Think how lovely that was, and gee, wouldn't it be great if it came true? It's too easy to forget that King was widely unpopular at the time of his assassination, not just because of his civil rights work, but because he took a strong stance against the Vietnam War, and especially, as we heard this morning, especially against poverty. He was standing with sanitation workers who were on strike for higher wages when he was killed. And nothing gets the wealthy riled up like talk of income inequality and of raising wages for the poor or the average worker. In fact, before Dr. King died, about 150 newspapers had published articles against him. Civil rights organizations had criticized him. Preachers had come out in their pulpits against him. His invitation to the White House had been revoked. But we forget that, and we think of Dr. King as a kumbaya mascot and keep on sleeping, dreaming. But as the Reverend Tracy Blackman says, we cannot continue to let years roll on saying, "I have a dream," because we refuse to wake up and speak out. We need to wake up and get on with Dr. King's agenda of civil rights, of tackling poverty and an economic system that is wildly inequitable, of ensuring that all children have access to a good education, an agenda of peace in the face of our thirst for war, an agenda of breaking down walls and barriers in the face of our thirst for othering and deciding who is fully human and worthy of respect and who is not. We need a religious agenda that reclaims Christ, the peace-loving, boundary-crossing, outsider-loving, empire-opposing, walking, talking love of God in the face of our thirst to wrap him in a national flag, stick a weapon in his hand, and use him to disenfranchise non-Christians or the wrong kind of Christians. An agenda with radical notions of fairness and inclusion that requires us to name and protest injustice wherever it exists and whatever the cost, but especially in this nation right now, because now, in such a time as this, sleeping is not an option. Sitting down is not an option. Silence is not an option. As Dr. King said, the calling to speak is often a vocation of agony, but we must speak. And we who claim to follow Christ, we have a lot to say, because everything that Dr. King railed against is still with us. While poverty rates have indeed dropped over the last few years, in 2023 there were still 36.8 million people in the U.S. officially below the poverty line, a line which stands at a laughable $32,150 annually for a family of 4. Imagine trying to survive on that and being told you don't qualify for any assistance at all if you make $32,151. In this nation that is the wealthiest the world has ever seen, 25 million people are uninsured, down from 32 million a few years ago, but still 25 million people. And the current administration says it will roll back health programs for the poor and the elderly, meaning that number will go back up. The U.S. has the worst maternal child-infant death rate among the richest nations. The rate for Black women is twice the rate for white women. And we are dead last in the list of so-called developed nations for health outcomes. Our public schools are in trouble because we have a system where schools are generally funded by property taxes. So wealthier areas have strong public schools, ironically, where families can already afford to send their children to private schools, while poor areas have public schools that are chronically underfunded, lacking in books. I visited one school in Philly about 10 years ago where the cafeteria had been out of commission for years. The children were eating lunch at their desks with cockroaches crawling everywhere. Women's rights are under attack, as the prevailing sentiment seems to be that women should be subordinate to their husbands, and control over what happens to our own bodies is out of our hands in many states. Black and brown people face a system where the Voting Rights Act is now weaker than it was in 1965, where gerrymandering and closing polling stations in predominantly Black areas systematically disenfranchises Black and brown voters, and the government is rolling back anti-discrimination policies, including halting all civil rights investigations and prosecutions. Trans people, at least according to the government, simply do not exist. And the refugee resettlement program has been frozen. All of this, as we claim to be a Christian nation. I have asked before if there was enough evidence to convict us as individuals of being Christian without us being able to say a word in our defense. And the same is true for us as a nation. It is hard to make a case that we are a Christian nation when we so clearly do not love our neighbors as ourselves, nor do we practice mercy, love, or humility in our common life. And what breaks my heart about all of this, I should say one of the things that breaks my heart, is that people and preachers have cherry-picked Bible verses to support all of this misery, this lack of mercy, this cruelty. Like the congressperson defending cuts to food stamps, quoting Jesus, saying, "The poor will be with you always," is proof of Jesus wanting some people to be hungry. Well, I'm here to say I know some Bible verses too. And I believe I have met the God we encounter in these Bible verses. From Isaiah, cry aloud, do not hold back. Declare to my people their rebellion. Loose the chains of injustice. Set the oppressed free and break every yoke. The Lord enters into judgment against the elders and leaders of this people. It is you who have ruined my vineyard. Plunder from the poor is in your houses. What do you mean by crushing my people and grinding the faces of the poor? Declares the Lord. Micah, what does the Lord require of you? Do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God. This is the kind of fast day I am after, to break the chains of injustice, get rid of exploitation in the workplace, free the oppressed, cancel debts. What I'm interested in seeing you do is sharing your food with the hungry, inviting the homeless poor into your homes, putting clothes on the shivering ill-clad. Leviticus, when a foreigner lives with you in your land, don't take advantage of him. Treat the foreigner the same as a native. Love him like one of your own. Proverbs, speak out on behalf of those people who have no voice and defend all those you have passed over. Open your mouth, judge fairly, and stand up for the rights of the afflicted and the poor. Isaiah, the Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me because the Lord has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives and release from darkness for the prisoners. And then there's Jesus himself saying, whatever you did for the least of these, you did to me. God so loved the world, and the ultimate standard set by Jesus, love your neighbor as yourself. Love one another. Notice he does not qualify who the neighbor is. He simply says, do love, be love. I could go on. 2,500 times the Bible refers to the poor, the needy, the orphan, the sick, and the widow. Caring for them is a central theme of our Holy Scripture from start to finish. And these are the verses we must reclaim and speak loudly and live, because silence is not an option. When I was on sabbatical a few years ago, I went to a small museum in Selma, Alabama. I was doing the Civil Rights Trail. It was a rather quirky little place, not much bigger than this church. It was at the base of the Edmund Pettus Bridge, right where the civil rights marchers had met with a sea of angry white law enforcement people and white citizens. Unlike most civil rights era museums, this one was not dedicated to the marquee names of the movement. Other than a passing mention, Dr. King, John Lewis, and other icons were not present in the exhibits. There was some civil rights era memorabilia. There was a complete Klan outfit on a mannequin. There was a dress that had been worn by one of the marchers. It had a rip in it and blood all over it because, of course, she had been beaten for standing up for her dignity. But the thing that moved me most was the shoes. So many shoes. Shoes of the thousands of people who marched that day. The shoes that took them across the Edmund Pettus Bridge and into an angry mob. The shoes of people willing to march, to be screamed at, to be called every nasty name under the sun, to be beaten, and even to be killed because they saw injustice and they spoke. They demanded respect and dignity. They spoke with their voices and with their bodies. They knew silence was not an option. Like many of you, like Martin, like those who marched with him, I am afraid. I'm sad. I'm angry. And Lord knows I'm tired. So tired of the exclusion, the injustice, the hatred in our common life. The problems we have as a nation are persistent and poisonous. and a big part of me wants to go away and sit down on a beach for a good long while. But while we all do need rest from time to time, to feed our bodies, minds, and souls is a holy thing. But we cannot check out permanently. There is work to do. And everyone has something we can do to make a stand for love. There is good trouble to get into. Mercy, justice, and love to enflesh and walk around in. There are some mighty big shoes sitting in a museum in Selma that need to be filled. And our call is to put them on and walk. Walk wherever God sends us, through cities and farmlands and over bridges. And as we walk, we are to speak loudly and clearly for love, for the dignity of every blessed human being, with our mouths and with our feet. Because sitting down and kicking our shoes off is not an option. Because for God's people, silence is not, has never been, will never be an option. May it be so.